In this lesson, I'm going to be showing you how to create an exposure meta node that we're going to be using in different areas of this training and in some of the other lessons. Uh, the exposure meta node is going to be really useful when working with photometric lighting and materials and clouds. So what we're going to do is assign this exposure node and set this up for an additional sunlight. And we're going to use this to split the diffuse and specular lighting in the scene. And for an example, what I want to do is just load in a plant species, and I'm going to load in the banana plant because it has a nice spectral light on the leaves. So first what I'm going to do is go into the sunlight, just double clicking on it to open up the editor and remove the specular lighting from that. And we can see that disappear in the main camera view. And then I'm just going to copy and paste the sunlight. So now we have another sunlight. Go into the editor again, turn on specular, and turn off diffuse. Now what you're going to notice is there is no specular light showing up. And that's because the photometric settings only apply to the first sunlight in the scene, which is basically like a distant light. You'll also notice that there's no control for adjusting the power of the light or the intensity of it other than the color. So what we're going to use is the color output and go beyond the initial output, which would be clamped by like an RGB value of 255. So we use the color output, and now we're going to create our exposure, which is going to be a 32-bit exposure. So for HDR lighting or photometric lighting. So the first thing I'm going to do is add in a constant node, and just right-clicking, go to constant, select a constant color, and I'm going to change this to white. So RGB value is 255 for all the way across. And now this is going to create a specular color of white and not the sunlight color. So we will need to modify this later or blend it with the sunlight color in order to match the rest of the scene or as it was before. So what we want to do is increase the intensity of this by multiplying it. So we're going to add in a math node, and we're going to use multiply by a constant. Now this will accept a color value. And we're going to multiply it by an exposure value. Now we could type in, I think in order to match, we need a value of 256, which is not an exposure value. And I'm going to just go ahead and adjust the output to the color so you can see the specular lighting showing back up in the render. And as you can see, it's white, just like the color here, so we would need to adjust the color to match the sun, or we can really pick whatever specular color we want. But this isn't going to match the exposure values in the rest of the scene, or if you were to go into, say, Photoshop and use the exposure, you're going to get a different value. So what we're going to do is design, just set up a couple of nodes just to mimic an exposure value or create an accurate exposure. And what we can do is go to the math nodes, and we're going to go to power. And I'm going to go ahead and expand it. And then I'm going to add in a constant node. We'll just do a constant number of 2. And we're going to connect this to the input of the power. So it's going to be 2 to the power of the exposure value. So it's actually a pretty simple setup to get exposure. And then if you want an sRGB exposure or an 8-bit exposure, then you do need to modify this a little more. We'll take a look at that after we set this up. So now I'm going to add in another constant node, connectable constant number. This way we could connect it to something else if we want to control the exposure with another setting. Because this node is extractable, we can connect that parameter to something else instead of entering in a value. So now we have our output, and what we want to do is control the multiply by with this output. We look and we're going to see no change, and this output value from the function node preview, which if you don't have that open, you can open it up here. And this will give us an extension of 1. So with an exposure value of 0, it's 1, so it's basically not multiplying it, it's not increasing it. And then if we started using negative values, it will reduce that 1 down to 0. So what I'm going to do is type in a value of 8. And that's going to give us an extension or an output of 256, which is equal to the exposure of the sunlight. And also remember that this exposure value is for 32-bit images. If you were to, say, try to replicate this exposure value with an 8-bit image, this is going to be way too powerful for that. So first, let's go ahead and just take this basically linear exposure, and we are going to create a meta node. After selecting them, and it looks like with the build I'm using right now, it's bugged and it is not letting me create a meta node. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and select the entire function and Control C on the keyboard to copy it. Okay, and just create a sphere really quick where I can edit the material, go into the color function, so right click, edit function, or you can control click on it, and then just Control V to paste it. And I'll go ahead and connect this to the color output just so I can avoid having to create an output node in the meta node. I'll go ahead and select those again and create a meta node. So it looks like I'll just have to create the meta nodes in a color output, and then I can just load them into the lights for the graph. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and now I'm going to edit the meta node, and we're going to take the connectable constant, which is our exposure value, and make that available by publishing the parameter. Change the name to exposure. And I'm going to go ahead and change the name of the input node to color. So that way we know we plug the color in and then we get the color out. And now we can save this. So I'm going to select save, and what you want to use is the meta node folder for your presets or all of the included content in the content directory that you selected when you installed it. The default in Windows is in the My Documents folder. I have mine set up on a different drive. But you have to go, in order to be able to access these directly from the function editor, at least easier anyway, you go to select the type of input, and by default not every type of node is included in here. So if you wanted to create, say, a constant meta node, then you just need to create a folder called constant, or a folder called turbulence or combiner within that directory right here. But we've got color set up, so I'm going to go into color and call this exposure. And for the description, I'm just going to give it a version 0.1. And that way, if we make modifications to it or set up that 8-bit version, we can essentially just create a new version. So now if we right click and we go to color and go to meta node, we're going to see, and actually it doesn't look like it's showing up yet. So maybe we need to reload the program in order to get that to load. But it did show up in the users meta nodes section on the left for now, so we can load that in easily just by double clicking. And actually it looks like it saved it as color, so it is in there. And that's probably because I clicked on color. So that gave the title of color, so we're gonna rename it exposure and just save over it. So now when we right click and go to color and go to meta nodes, we can see the exposure and load it in that way too. So since I got that saved out, I'm just going to cancel that and delete the sphere, go into the sunlight and load in the color meta nodes exposure. And then we can take that constant node, we can delete the rest of these. Connect the color to that exposure meta node, and our input will be that constant color. And if we go to the constant color, and we could either use a combiner node and kind of blend it with another color, or we can just modify this main color in order to get something a little closer to the sunlight value. And then if you want to see a comparison, what you can do is open the original sunlight, turn specular back on, turn off that new light, and it looks like the sunlight's going to be a little lighter than the color we've got, which is why I like to use a blender usually. So what we can do is go back into the specular light and add in a combiner node blender. I'm going to just copy and paste the constant node, change it back to white, open the blender, have input 0 as white, and input 1 is that yellowish orange kind of color. Connect our output to the exposure, and then what we can do is blend it to that color. So make it a little lighter, or we can just modify the color. That looks a little better. And now we have two independent lights, one for diffuse and one for specular. Now, because linking these two lights together can cause some problems because of the way the position of the sunlight changes so frequently and kind of bounces around the scene. It doesn't really matter where the position is, just the orientation. But if you link the orientation of this light to the other light, it does tend to cause some problems. Sometimes it'll jump around. I'm going to see if we might be able to do it if we make sure that point at camera is turned off, at least for the specular light. Go into the orientation input node, and we're going to change it to the sunlight orientation and connect it to the orientation output. And now let's see what happens. If we go into the atmosphere editor and just hit F4 on the keyboard, go to sun, and modify the azimuth and the pitch. Now if I adjust the pitch, you can see we lost the scene. And that's because the sunlight, the other one, has gone off who knows where. And basically it's modifying the OpenGL. If we go to File, Options, and the OpenGL clipping, because auto is set, it's adjusting the far plane distance and the near plane distance to values outside of the scene because this light is way out of reach. One thing we might be able to do is to add in a math node, vector operations. Or actually, we'll go ahead and add it instead a constant vector of 0 and set that to the position. And maybe that'll fix that. And it does look like it did something rather interesting. So it looks like that connection probably isn't a good idea. So instead of using the graph, it looks like I undid it too much. And go and delete those connections. And then what you want to do is just go to the sunlight, go to the numerics tab up at the top, go to the orientation, and you could just copy and paste these values. If you change the sunlight over to the spectral light. And linking them before didn't used to be a problem in previous versions of Vue. It looks like it. This version, this build, is a little bugged for that. We're now going to take a look at modifying the exposure meta node to be useful for texture maps that are 8-bit. So what I'm going to do for this is just add a sphere to the scene. Open up the material and go to mapped picture. And then we're just going to load in a texture map. We can just load in one of the textures that come with. Just going to go ahead and select the brick texture and click OK. And then I'm going to set this to object parametric. And that should be a good enough example. So then we're going to right click and edit the function. And we'll first start by right clicking, going to color, meta nodes, and loading in the exposure meta node we created before. Connect that to the projected texture map. Also reset the exposure to 0 because I saved that one with an exposure of 8. And then connect the color output to the exposure output. So what we need to do is reduce the output and use what's called a reverse gamma exposure in order to equal, say, the same exposure values that you would get in Photoshop when working with an 8-bit image. And this will actually give you the exact same values as you would get in programs like Photoshop when modifying 8-bit. So what we need to do is modify the power, and then we're also going to need to modify the output gamma. Now, if you're working with a default gamma, what you want to do is override the gamma to 1. For the texture map input, because we do need specific values for this. So what we're going to do is modify the constant node of 2 with another power. So go to Math, select Power, and our input for the first power will connect to the output, the new power input to 2, and now we just need to change the exponent value for the new power setting. So what we're going to do is add in a combiner node, blender, and change this to divide. And then we're going to add 2 constant nodes, constant numbers, and I can just copy and paste. And what we want to do is take 1, value of 1 for input 0, and divide that by 2.2, which is essentially the gamma value, and that's going to give you the reverse gamma output. Connect that to the exponent. And then, so if we go ahead and modify the exposure, we can see where we'd normally have really, really high values. If we take a look at the output for the multiply, we've actually got 3.53 with a value of 4. Now what we also need to do is add one more gamma to the output, which is going to be, you can go to color, color correction, and gamma. And we're going to set that to 2.2. And there's just one more thing we need to do, and that is to change actually the input gamma. So we can use, if your system gamma is 2.2, and actually that's going to be a little different. So I'll just override it to 1. We'll go into the node, and we'll set the gamma to be part of the divide output, which is around like 0.47. So we go to the color, color correction, gamma, and then connect that, and then go to the gamma output. And that should fix everything up. And now we have a more limited exposure value. And then we can also use negative values to darken. the texture map. And then I'll just go ahead and save this as exposure 8-bit. Make sure we change the title because that's what's going to show up within the function editor. So now when we go into the color meta nodes, we now have the 8-bit exposure that we can use for texture maps, because those are going to be limited to the 8-bit range unless you're using a 32-bit texture map.